The little black girl ran to the biker across the desert station as a shadow followed her through the dusty road. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a blistering afternoon in the middle of the desert. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the desert floor into an endless stretch of dry, cracked earth. Dust swirled in the air, kicked up by the strong desert winds. A lone figure emerged from the horizon, her small frame barely visible against the vast, barren landscape. It was a little black girl, no more than 10 years old, her clothes torn and her feet bare. She had been running for what felt like hours, her small chest heaving as she gasped for breath. Her eyes darted nervously over her shoulder, glancing at the shadow that was following her. A figure, distant yet menacing, was trailing her through the desert. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had to get away. She had to find help. Her mind raced, thinking of any place where she could be safe. Then, ahead of her, she saw it, a small desert station, a rest stop with a dusty parking lot and a few parked cars. She had no choice. She sprinted toward it, the distant figure still trailing her, never once letting up. The station was almost deserted, with only a few motorcycles parked under the harsh midday sun. But then, as she approached, she noticed a man standing by one of the bikes, wiping his hands on a rag. His dark leather vest caught the sunlight, and his face was stern but kind. He looked like someone who had seen a lot in his life, someone who understood what it meant to fight for what mattered. The little girl didn't hesitate. She ran straight to him, her voice breaking as she cried out, "Please help me. He's after me." The biker froze for a moment, surprised by the sudden appearance of the girl, but something in her desperate eyes made him act without thinking. He quickly stepped forward, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The girl glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered, trembling. "He's been following me for miles. He won't stop. Please, I need help." The biker nodded, his face hardening. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of a child who had nowhere else to turn. Without saying another word, he motioned for her to follow him. "Get on the bike," he said, already walking towards his motorcycle. The girl hesitated for only a moment before she climbed onto the back of the bike, clutching onto him for dear life. The biker revved the engine, the deep rumble of the motorcycle filling the air. He turned the throttle, and they were off, speeding down the dusty road, leaving the rest stop and the shadow in the distance behind. The girl glanced back one last time, but the shadow was already gone. She was safe, for now, but she knew the danger was far from over. As the biker sped through the desert, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the empty landscape. The girl, exhausted but relieved, rested her head against his back, her body trembling as the wind rushed past. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she wasn't alone. The wind howled through the desert as the biker and the little girl raced down the road, the rumbling of the motorcycle echoing across the barren landscape. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the endless stretch of sand and dust. The girl clutched onto the biker tightly, her small hands gripping the leather of his jacket as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She had never been so scared in her life, but there was a strange sense of safety now, sitting behind this stranger, the sound of the engine drowning out the fear in her mind. They had been riding for what felt like hours, the road stretching on endlessly. The biker knew they had to keep moving. He couldn't let her down, not after everything she had already been through. He had made a promise to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. The shadow that had followed her was nowhere in sight, but he knew better than to think they were safe just yet. The girl's voice broke through the wind, her words barely audible. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. The biker glanced down at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "We're heading to a safe place," he replied, his tone reassuring. "Don't worry, we'll get there." She nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. She had been through too much to believe everything would be okay so easily. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the air grew colder. The biker felt the chills seeping through his jacket, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not until they were safe. As they continued on, the girl shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting around the desert. "Do you think he's still following us?" she asked. The biker kept his eyes focused on the road ahead, but his grip on the handlebars tightened. "We're out of his reach for now," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But we need to get to a place where we can hide. A place where he can't find you." The girl fell silent, and the only sound was the roar of the motorcycle and the whistling of the wind. The miles stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. The road ahead seemed never-ending, the landscape flat and featureless. It was as if the world had closed in on them, leaving them stranded in the vast emptiness of the desert. The biker knew they needed to find shelter soon. The night was coming fast, and with it, the danger of being caught. After what felt like an eternity, a small light appeared in the distance. It was faint, barely visible against the darkening sky, but the biker's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. A small gas station, with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." It was their best shot at finding shelter. He accelerated, pushing the bike faster as they neared the station. The girl glanced up, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Is that a place we can hide?" she asked. "I think so," the biker replied, his voice tight. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." He pulled the bike into the parking lot, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be watching. The station was nearly deserted, with only a few cars parked under the dim lights. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the empty lot. The biker cut the engine, the sudden silence making the air feel heavier. He motioned for the girl to stay low as he led her toward the small building. "Stay behind me," he whispered. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the ground. As they reached the door, the biker pushed it open slowly, glancing around to make sure no one was there. The inside of the station was dimly lit, with old shelves stocked with snacks and drinks. The air was stale, but it was quiet, and that was all that mattered. The biker led the girl to the back of the station, where a small door led to a back room. He opened it and motioned for her to go inside. "Wait here," he said, his voice low. "I'll make sure it's safe." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. She stepped inside the small room and crouched down, pulling her knees to her chest as she hugged them tightly. She could hear the biker moving around outside, his footsteps heavy and determined. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The girl's mind raced. Was it really over? Had they finally escaped? Or was the shadow still out there, lurking just beyond the safety of the station? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. The silence in the back room of the gas station felt almost suffocating as the little girl huddled in the corner, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. She could still feel the vibrations of the motorcycle's engine in her bones, but now all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. The biker had left her there, telling her to stay hidden and quiet. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching out longer than the last. She didn't know what to expect next. Was the shadow still following them? Had they truly escaped? Or was it only a matter of time before the danger found them again? Her mind raced with questions, but deep down, she knew one thing for sure. The man who had taken her on the back of his bike wasn't just some stranger. He was different, someone who had made a promise, and she could tell he wouldn't break it. The seconds ticked by, and then, finally, she heard footsteps approaching the back room. She froze, her heart racing. The door creaked open, and the biker stepped inside, his face shadowed by the dim light. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The girl was the first to break the silence. "Is he still out there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The biker didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved over to the corner of the room, checking the locks on the door. He pulled a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and shone it around the room. It was a small, cluttered space, but it was the safest place they had right now. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low and cautious. "But we're not going anywhere until we know it's safe." The girl nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for the man who had taken her in. He had no obligation to help her, and yet, here he was, keeping his promise to her father. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The biker glanced at her, his face softening for a moment. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it hurt him more than he wanted to admit. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I promised your father I'd look after you. That's what I'm going to do." He paused for a moment, staring at the girl as if searching for something. "Your father was a good man. He saved my life once. I'll never forget that." The girl blinked, her eyes wide. "He saved your life?" she asked, her voice trembling. The biker nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, back in the war. He saved my life when we were both deployed. Took a bullet for me." He shook his head, as if shaking off the memory. "I promised him that I would protect you, no matter what. And I intend to keep that promise." The girl felt a knot tighten in her throat. She had never really known her father. He had been gone before she was old enough to remember much about him. But hearing this man speak of him like that made her feel closer to him, like he was still watching over her in some way. "I miss him," she whispered, her voice breaking. The biker didn't know what to say to that. There were no words that could fill the emptiness left by the loss of a parent. Instead, he walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent gesture of comfort. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The girl nodded, wiping away the tear that had started to fall. She felt a little bit safer now, but the fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind. The biker turned and moved to the small window, peering out through the dusty glass. His eyes scanned the darkened parking lot outside, the shadows long and stretching across the ground. He could sense the danger still lingering in the air, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. "Not yet. We're going to stay here for a while," he said, his voice steady. "Get some rest. We'll head out at dawn." The girl didn't argue. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She lay down on the dusty floor, curling up into a ball, trying to block out the fear that still clung to her. The biker watched over her as she drifted off to sleep, his eyes never leaving the dark, empty parking lot. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not on his watch. As the night stretched on, the desert outside remained still, the only sounds the distant hum of the wind and the faint rustling of the sand. The girl slept soundly for the first time in days, but the biker stayed awake, his mind racing. He knew the danger wasn't over, not yet. But for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, they could rest. The first light of dawn slowly crept across the desert as the biker quietly stood by the small window, watching the horizon. He had stayed up the entire night, keeping his eyes on the parking lot and the surrounding desert. The little girl slept soundly on the floor behind him, her chest rising and falling steadily, finally at peace for the first time in what felt like forever. But the biker knew the danger was far from over. He couldn't let his guard down, not yet. The wind outside had picked up, carrying with it the promise of another long, exhausting day. He turned away from the window and walked toward the girl, kneeling down beside her. She was curled up tightly, her small body still trembling from the fear she had felt the night before. He gently shook her shoulder, waking her up softly. "Hey kid," he said quietly. "It's time to go." The girl stirred and slowly opened her eyes, blinking as she adjusted to the dim light. For a moment, she didn't seem to remember where she was. Then, as the memories came flooding back, her eyes widened with fear. She sat up quickly, looking around the room. "Is it safe?" she whispered. The biker nodded. "For now it is. But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here long." The girl nodded silently, the weight of the situation settling back in. She had been running for so long, and now, as they prepared to leave, the uncertainty of what lay ahead made her stomach twist. The biker stood up and motioned for her to follow him. "Let's go. Stay close." They exited the back room, the biker leading the way as they moved through the small station. The girl followed closely behind, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, unsure of what to expect. As they stepped outside, the harsh light of the morning sun hit them, making the desert landscape stretch out endlessly before them. The biker's motorcycle was parked just a few feet away, its chrome gleaming in the sunlight. He walked toward it, kicking the stand and lifting the bike onto its wheels. The girl hesitated for a moment, standing still in the middle of the parking lot, her gaze fixed on the open road ahead. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the fear of the unknown creeping in once again. The biker glanced back at her, his face unreadable. You ready? He asked. The girl took a deep breath, nodding slowly. She didn't have much choice. She was in this now, and there was no turning back. She climbed onto the bike behind him, gripping tightly onto his jacket. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady but quiet. The biker started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through her body. He glanced over his shoulder one more time, making sure no one was watching them, then revved the throttle and sped off. The wind whipped past them as they sped down the road, the familiar feeling of freedom washing over the biker. But as they rode, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they weren't truly safe. The road ahead was long, and they were far from the clear. They needed to get to a place where they could hide, somewhere far enough away from the shadow that had been trailing them. As they rode, the girl kept her eyes on the horizon, trying to push away the fear that gnawed at her. She wanted to believe they were safe, but the reality of their situation kept creeping back into her mind. Who was the shadow? Why had it been following her? And was it still out there? She didn't know the answers to any of these questions, but one thing was certain. She couldn't do this alone. She had to trust the biker. She had no other choice. The road stretched out before them, the empty desert on either side. The sun was now high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The biker kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He didn't like the uncertainty, but he had no choice. He had to protect her. He had promised her father he would. As they continued down the road, the landscape slowly began to change. The desert started to give way to scrubby bushes and the occasional cactus, signs that they were nearing civilization. The girl felt a small sense of hope rise within her. Maybe they were getting closer to safety. But the biker didn't slow down. He knew better than to get too comfortable. They were still a long way from being in the clear. As they approached a small town in the distance, the biker pulled off the main road and turned onto a side street. The girl looked around, confused. Where are we going? She asked. The biker didn't answer right away. He simply kept his eyes on the road, the sound of the engine drowning out the growing tension in the air. After a moment, he spoke. We need to lay low for a while. This town will do. We can figure out our next move once we're safe. The girl nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. She just wanted to be somewhere safe. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting for them to slip up. The biker pulled up to a small, run-down motel, the neon sign flickering weakly in the afternoon light. He cut the engine and motioned for the girl to stay low. Stay close. And don't make any noise. The girl nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was starting to learn one thing. She had to trust the biker, because he was the only one who had ever kept her safe. The biker and the little girl stayed low as they made their way into the small, run-down motel. The biker kept his eyes sharp, scanning the parking lot, the street, and even the windows of the motel as they walked toward the office. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the dusty pavement. The girl felt a mix of exhaustion and unease settling deep in her bones. She had no idea what to expect next, but she knew they couldn't afford to be careless. As they reached the door to the office, the biker turned to the girl. Stay behind me, he whispered, his voice steady, though there was an underlying tension that she could feel. She nodded and stepped back, her eyes wide, watching the biker carefully. He knocked twice on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet evening air. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing an older man behind the counter. He looked at the biker with suspicion, then at the girl, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. Can I help you? The man asked, his voice gruff. The biker took a step forward, his expression unreadable. We need a room, he said simply. The man eyed them for a moment before nodding. You got ID? He asked. The biker shook his head. No, just need a place to stay for the night. He replied, his tone firm but not aggressive. The man hesitated. For a moment longer, then sighed, reaching for the register. You're lucky we got a room open. But no funny business, you hear? The biker nodded and handed over a few crumpled bills. The man took the money, handed over a key, and waved them toward the back of the motel. Room 12. Last one on the left. Don't cause any trouble. The biker gave him a brief nod, then turned toward the girl. They made their way down the narrow path between the buildings, their footsteps muted by the worn-out carpet inside the hallway. The girl felt a knot in her stomach as they approached the door to their room. It was a small, dimly lit space with old furniture, the bed covered in a thin, faded blanket. The smell of mildew hung in the air. The biker glanced around the room, checking for any signs of danger before he motioned for the girl to come inside. "It's not much, but it'll do for tonight," he said, his voice softer now. The girl nodded but didn't speak, still too tired and scared to say anything. She walked over to the bed and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. The biker walked over to the window, peeking through the blinds to scan the area. The parking lot was empty, but the air was thick with tension. He could feel it, the sense that they weren't safe yet. He had made a promise to protect her, but the dangers were still out there, lurking in the shadows. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," the biker said, his voice firm. "Get some rest. We'll figure out our next move." The girl didn't respond at first. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll find us here?" The biker looked over at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't want to lie to her, but he didn't want to scare her even more. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Not while I'm here." She nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. She had been running for so long, and the thought that the shadow was still out there, waiting for them to slip up, made her heart race. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going like this. The biker could see the fear in her eyes, and it made him want to do whatever it took to end this nightmare for her. He didn't want her to live like this anymore. He walked over to the bed and sat down beside her. "Hey," he said gently, "you're safe here. For tonight, at least. You don't have to worry about anything. I've got you." The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of doubt, but there was something in his voice that made her believe him. She didn't know if they would make it out of this mess alive, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. She laid down on the bed, pulling the thin blanket over her, and closed her eyes. The biker stayed by the window, keeping watch. The night stretched on, and though the room was quiet, there was a sense of unease hanging in the air. He didn't trust that they were truly safe, but for now, there was nothing more he could do except protect her the best way he knew how. As the night grew darker, the sounds of the desert seemed to fade, and all that remained was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. The girl fell asleep, exhausted from the fear and the uncertainty. But the biker stayed awake, his eyes scanning the parking lot and the road beyond. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not yet. The morning came too quickly. The biker had hardly slept, his mind constantly on edge, watching the parking lot from the small motel window. The girl was still asleep, curled up under the thin blanket on the bed. The dust from the desert outside seemed to settle into the room, making everything feel more suffocating than it already was. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. They needed to keep moving. The promise he made to her father was clear. He had to protect her at all costs. It didn't matter that he didn't know the full story, or that he didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't let her fall back into the hands of whoever was chasing her. He glanced at the girl, her face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the looming danger outside. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax. She was safe, at least for now. But that peace didn't last. There was a knock on the door. It was soft at first, then more insistent. The biker immediately tensed, his muscles stiffening. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew they were here. At least, he hoped no one did. He walked cautiously toward the door, making sure to stay out of sight. The girl stirred on the bed, waking up slowly. The biker put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. The knock came again, louder this time. Whoever was out there wasn't going to give up easily. The biker reached for his jacket, slipping it on quickly. He moved to the window, carefully lifting the blinds to peek outside. His heart skipped a beat. There was a car parked near the entrance of the motel, an old, dusty sedan with tinted windows. It was unfamiliar. The girl noticed the biker's tense expression. "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice still thick with sleep. "I don't know," he replied, his voice low and cautious. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." He turned back to the door, listening intently. The sound of footsteps came from the hallway. The biker stepped away from the door, his instincts telling him to prepare for something bad. "Get ready," he whispered to the girl. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't have to ask what was going on. She could feel the tension in the air, the fear that something was about to go wrong. The biker reached for his helmet and pulled it over his head, then opened the door just enough to peek outside. He saw a man standing in the hallway, his eyes darting around as if searching for something. The biker's heart raced. This wasn't good. The man turned and knocked on the door next to theirs, his knock firm and deliberate. The biker didn't wait. He motioned for the girl to stay low, then moved quietly to the side of the room, positioning himself near the window. He needed to see what was going on, but he didn't want to get caught off guard. The man outside knocked again. "Room 12, he muttered under his breath. "I know you're in there." The biker froze. He recognized that voice. It was the same voice from the night before, the man who had checked them into the motel, the man who had given them the room without asking too many questions. What had changed? Why was he back? The biker knew something wasn't right. This was no coincidence. "Stay down," he whispered to the girl, his voice tight with urgency. He crept closer to the door, trying to listen for any sound that might give him a clue. There was no sound from the hallway now, but the tension in the air was palpable. The biker's mind raced. Was the man working with someone else? Was this the shadow, or was it someone else entirely? He turned back to the girl, his face grim. "We need to move. Now." He motioned for her to grab her things. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Who is that?" The biker didn't answer her right away. Instead, he moved toward the window and peered outside again. The car was still there, parked in the same spot. There was no sign of movement, but he knew better than to trust that. He had to act quickly. "We're leaving," he said. "Stay close to me, and don't make any noise." The girl nodded, grabbing her bag and following him toward the door. The biker opened the door slowly, scanning the hallway for any sign of danger. It was empty, but he didn't trust it. They had to get out of there. He motioned for the girl to follow him, and they moved as quietly as possible, making their way down the hallway. Every step felt like it could be their last. The biker kept his eyes on the exit, his body tense as he moved. They had almost reached the door when he heard the sound of footsteps behind them. Someone was coming. He didn't wait to see who it was. He grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her toward the side door, the back exit that led to the alley behind the motel. He kicked the door open, and they both slipped out into the cool morning air. They were out of sight, but they weren't safe yet. The biker glanced around quickly, looking for a place to hide. They couldn't just walk out into the open. They needed cover. The girl looked up at him, her face pale with fear. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. The biker didn't answer her immediately. He had to think fast. They were in a dangerous situation, and they needed to keep moving. "We find a new place," he said finally. "We keep running until we can't be found." He looked at her one last time, his expression hardening. "And we don't stop." The cold morning air stung as the biker and the little girl moved quickly through the back alley behind the motel. The girl kept close to him, her eyes wide with fear, as they darted from shadow to shadow, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the silence of the desert, but the biker knew they couldn't risk being caught in the open. They had to keep moving. They had to get as far away as possible. The biker's mind raced as they moved down the narrow path. The motel was behind them now, but the shadow, the one that had been following the girl, could still be out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had no idea who it was or why they were being chased, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not with her life on the line. "We need to get to the truck," the biker muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the girl's arm as he guided her forward. She nodded silently, her face pale, her eyes flicking nervously around every corner. She had never been this scared in her life, and though the biker had promised to protect her, the fear still gnawed at her. "How much further?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much," he replied. "Stay close." They reached the end of the alley and emerged onto the main street. The biker glanced up and down the road, scanning for any sign of danger. It was still early, and the streets were mostly empty. They could see the truck parked a few blocks away, its engine cold, but it was their only option. He took a deep breath, then pulled the girl toward the truck. They moved quickly, as quietly as possible, but every step felt like it could be their last. As they neared the truck, the biker turned to the girl. "You stay in the truck. I'll drive. Don't make a sound." She nodded again, her body tense. He could feel her fear radiating off of her, but there was nothing he could do to take it away. The only thing he could do was get her out of this mess alive. He opened the truck door, letting the girl climb in first, then slid into the driver's seat. The truck's engine roared to life as he started it, and for a brief moment, the familiar sound gave him a sense of relief. They were on the move, but the tension never left. He could still feel the eyes of the world on them, as if something, or someone, was always watching. The truck bounced down the road, kicking up dust as it rumbled through the quiet desert landscape. The girl sat in the passenger seat, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone to appear behind them. The biker kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly calculating the best route to take. They couldn't afford to stay on the main roads. They had to be quick. He took a sharp turn off the highway, heading onto a dirt road that twisted through the desert. It was a rough, isolated path, one that would make it harder for anyone to follow them. But it also meant they were heading deeper into nowhere. "Where are we going?" the girl asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Somewhere safe," the biker replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "We just need to keep moving. Don't worry." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if that was true. There was no place in the desert that could truly be considered safe, not with someone hunting them. The girl didn't respond, but he could feel her eyes on him. She trusted him, and that trust was a heavy weight on his shoulders. He couldn't let her down. Not now. The truck bounced over the rough terrain, kicking up clouds of dust behind them. The biker glanced at the rearview mirror once more, his eyes scanning the horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following them. The road was empty, but the shadow that had been trailing them. He couldn't escape the feeling that it was still out there. "We can't stop," the biker muttered to himself, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He pushed the pedal harder, trying to gain more speed. The truck lurched forward, picking up momentum as they sped through the desert. The girl gripped the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how long they would keep driving or where they were headed, but all she could do was trust him. Her mind raced with the same question over and over. Who was chasing her, and why? What did they want? The answers seemed just out of reach, but the fear was all too real. The wind howled through the cracks in the truck's windows, and the sun beat down relentlessly. The desert stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of sand and dirt. There was nothing but the sound of the truck's engine and the wind, and the ever-present feeling that danger was just around the corner. As the truck veered around another bend, the girl caught a glimpse of something in the distance, dark figures moving along the horizon. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, trying to make out what it was. But the biker didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the road, his eyes darting back and forth, watching for any sign of danger. "What is it?" the girl asked, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The biker didn't answer immediately. He just kept driving, his face set in grim determination. The figures in the distance were getting closer, but he wasn't slowing down. He had to keep moving. There was no time to waste. He could only hope that they wouldn't be noticed. But as the figures grew clearer, he realized with a sickening feeling that there was no avoiding them. He was out of options, and they were getting closer. The figures in the distance were getting closer now, and the biker's pulse quickened. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. The truck bounced over the rough terrain, its engine roaring as it pushed forward through the desert. The little girl sat in the passenger seat, her eyes wide, scanning the landscape nervously. She had seen the dark figures too, and now she could feel the tension in the air. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't respond at first. He was concentrating too hard on the road ahead, trying to determine whether the figures were a threat or just another mirage in the vast desert. His instincts told him they were trouble. "Stay down," he finally said, his voice low but urgent. The girl leaned back in her seat, her heart racing. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get dangerous. The biker swerved the truck around a curve, trying to put some distance between them and the approaching figures. But it was too late. As they came around the next bend, the figures were right there in front of them, blocking the road. The biker slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just a few feet away from them. There were 3 men standing in the middle of the road, their faces hidden under dark hoods. The air was thick with tension as the biker stared them down, his hand resting on the door handle. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the danger in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm was about to break. The biker's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the warning in his tone. "Get out of the way," he said, his eyes locked on the men in front of him. One of the men stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of a gun at his side. "You've got nowhere to go," the man said, his voice cold and threatening. "We've been looking for you." The biker didn't flinch. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. He knew they couldn't afford to fight. There were too many of them, and he couldn't risk the girl's safety. He had to think fast. The girl's heart was pounding in her chest as she looked at the men, her mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. Why were they after her? Who were they? "I said move," the biker repeated, his voice low and dangerous. The man didn't move, but his hand tightened around the gun. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, without warning, the biker slammed the truck into reverse, sending the vehicle lurching backward. The men hesitated for a second, then started to move toward the truck. "Drive," the girl shouted, panic rising in her chest. The biker didn't need any more encouragement. He threw the truck into gear and floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as they shot backward down the road, away from the men. The truck bounced and swerved, but the biker kept it steady, steering it with precision as they raced toward the next turn. Behind them, the men were shouting, but the biker didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. His mind was focused entirely on getting them out of this mess. The girl gripped the seat with white knuckles, her body pressed against the backrest as the truck sped through the desert. The dust was thick in the air, and she could barely see anything outside the window. Her heart was still pounding, but now there was a new sense of urgency in her chest. They needed to get as far away as possible. The biker glanced at her, his face grim. "Hold on," he said. "We're not out of the woods yet." The truck roared down the road, kicking up dust and debris in its wake. The figures were still behind them, but the biker was determined to lose them. He swerved the truck onto a smaller dirt path, the tires screeching as they dug into the sand. The road was even rougher here, but he didn't slow down. He had to get them away from the men. He had to protect her. The girl's mind was racing as they bounced along the uneven path. She had no idea where they were going or how they would get out of this, but she knew one thing for sure. The biker was her only chance. He was the only one who had kept his promise to her father. He was the only one who had stood up for her when no one else would. The truck jolted again as they hit a large rock, but the biker didn't flinch. He kept his focus on the road, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The girl looked out the back window, half expecting to see the men following them, but the road behind them was empty. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe they had escaped, but she knew better than to think they were safe yet. The biker was right. They weren't out of the woods yet. The truck bounced and swerved down the dirt path, but the biker didn't let up. He kept his foot on the gas, determined to get them out of this alive. The sun was now high in the sky, the heat of the desert beginning to make everything feel like it was closing in on them. But the biker didn't slow down. They couldn't stop until they were sure they were safe. The girl looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude, but also full of fear. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew that as long as they kept moving, they had a chance. And with the biker by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. The truck sped down the dirt path, the engine roaring as it bounced over rocks and uneven ground. The biker's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He could feel the tension in his body, every muscle coiled, every nerve alert. They had managed to break away from the men chasing them, but he knew better than to think they were safe. Not yet. The desert stretched out ahead of them, empty and vast, but the danger was still very real. The girl, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, her heart racing. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the motel, but she was wide-eyed and nervous, her hands clutching the seat beneath her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her fear palpable, as if expecting the men to appear at any moment. The biker could feel her fear, but he didn't say anything. He had to stay focused. How much farther? The girl asked after a long silence, her voice shaky. The biker's eyes flicked to the road ahead, scanning for any signs of trouble. Not much, he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. They had taken a series of twists and turns, heading deeper into the desert, but he wasn't certain of their exact location. They had to find somewhere safe to rest, somewhere far enough from the men chasing them. His mind raced, thinking of their options. The truck wasn't built for long journeys in the desert, and they couldn't afford to run out of gas or get stranded. His plan was to get them as far away from the danger as possible and then figure out their next move. But for now, he needed to keep moving. "We'll find a place soon," he said, trying to reassure her, though his voice was tight. The girl didn't respond, but she nodded slowly, her face pale. She didn't feel reassured. She didn't feel safe, and the biker could see it in her eyes. She was scared, just like him. The road ahead grew rougher, the truck bouncing harder as they hit another series of rocks. The biker gritted his teeth, trying to keep the vehicle under control. The last thing they needed was to wreck in the middle of nowhere with no way to fix it. "Hold on," he said, his voice clipped. The girl grabbed onto the door handle, her body tensing as the truck swerved slightly. The desert stretched on for miles, an endless sea of dry sand and scrub. There was nothing for miles, and the biker couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Are we safe now?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He didn't know. They had been lucky so far, but he wasn't foolish enough to believe it would last. The men who had been chasing them weren't the kind to give up easily. They'd come for her once, and they would come again. It was only a matter of time. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are they after me?" The biker's grip tightened on the wheel. He had no answer for her. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted. All he knew was that they were dangerous. "I don't know," he said softly, his voice filled with frustration. "But I'm going to keep you safe. I promise." The girl didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes, the determination to protect her. She believed him, but the doubt lingered in the back of her mind. What if he couldn't keep that promise? What if they weren't strong enough to outrun whatever was chasing them? The truck hit another bump, and the girl winced, gripping the seat tighter. "We're getting close," the biker said, his voice rough with the strain of the ride. "Just a little farther, and we'll stop." The girl nodded, though she didn't feel any less anxious. The air in the truck felt thick with tension. They were both on edge, both waiting for the inevitable to happen. As the truck crested a small hill, the biker's eyes widened in surprise. In the distance, barely visible against the desert backdrop, there was a small cluster of buildings. It looked like an abandoned settlement, the kind of place that might have been forgotten by time. "There," the biker said, pointing toward the buildings. "We'll stop there." The girl looked out the window, her eyes narrowing. "What is that place?" she asked. The biker shrugged. "I don't know, but it's as good a place as any to rest. We'll figure out our next move once we're there." He pushed the pedal to the floor, and the truck surged forward, heading toward the abandoned settlement. As they got closer, the girl could see the outlines of the buildings more clearly. The place looked deserted, with broken windows and doors hanging off their hinges. It had clearly been a long time since anyone had lived there. The truck pulled up to the nearest building, and the biker killed the engine. He motioned for the girl to stay inside while he checked things out. She nodded, her eyes darting nervously around the deserted settlement. The biker stepped out of the truck and walked toward the building, his steps slow and cautious. He didn't trust this place. He didn't trust anyone. Not anymore. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. Whatever came next, he had to be ready for it. And he had to keep her safe. The biker slowly approached the door of the abandoned building, his boots crunching softly on the sand and dirt beneath him. Every nerve in his body was on high alert, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The wind had picked up again, swirling dust and debris through the air. The girl sat in the truck, her eyes wide and anxious, her hands gripping the seat as she watched him. He turned back to her for a brief moment, his eyes meeting hers. Without saying a word, he gave a small nod, signaling for her to stay put. The silence between them was heavy, but she understood. He was doing everything he could to keep her safe. As the biker reached the door, he carefully tested the handle, turning it slowly. The door creaked on its hinges, but it didn't budge. He pushed harder, and it swung open with a loud groan. Inside, the building was even more decrepit than it had appeared from the outside. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were covered in layers of peeling paint. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. It was a ghost town. He stepped inside cautiously, his boots echoing in the empty space. The room was dark, save for the little light that filtered in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. His hand hovered near the gun on his belt, just in case. He moved through the space methodically, checking corners and behind the broken furniture. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, but after a few tense moments, he relaxed slightly. There was no immediate danger. Satisfied, he returned to the door, looking back at the truck. He motioned for the girl to come in. She hesitated for a moment, her nerves still on edge, but when she saw the look on his face, she nodded and climbed out of the truck. The girl moved quickly toward the building, keeping her head down and her eyes alert. She could feel the biker's gaze on her, and she trusted him, but it didn't make the situation any less frightening. They entered the building together, and the girl immediately felt a sense of unease. The air was stale, and the darkness made it feel like the walls were closing in on her. The biker led the way through the empty building, his movements careful, each step deliberate. "We'll stay here for a bit," he said, his voice low. "Just until we figure out what to do next." The girl nodded but didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to say. She was tired, scared, and felt more alone than she ever had. But the biker was here, and for now, that had to be enough. They found a small room near the back of the building, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. It was mostly empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture. The girl sat down on a cracked chair in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest. The biker stood by the door, keeping watch. There was a heavy silence between them, neither of them sure of what to say next. The girl glanced at him, watching the way he stood, his posture tense as he kept his eyes on the door. It was clear he was worried, but he was trying to hide it. She wanted to tell him that she was scared too, that she didn't know how much longer she could keep running. But she didn't. She didn't want to show him how afraid she really was. Instead, she just sat there, lost in her thoughts. The biker finally broke the silence. "I don't know who they are," he said quietly, "but I'm going to make sure they don't get to you. I promise." His words were reassuring, but they didn't completely ease her fear. She wanted to believe him. She had to. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the men who had been chasing her, heard the sound of their footsteps growing closer. The fear felt like a constant presence, hovering just outside of her reach. "Do you think they'll come after us here?" she asked, her voice small. The biker's eyes narrowed slightly as he thought. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "But if they do, we'll be ready. We won't let them get you." The girl nodded, though her heart was still pounding. She had no idea how they were going to escape this, but for now, the biker's words were all she had to hold on to. As the minutes passed, the silence between them grew more comfortable. The girl's eyes began to drift shut, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But she forced herself to stay awake. She couldn't afford to sleep, not with everything that was happening. The biker, noticing her growing fatigue, walked over to the window and peeked through the cracks in the boarded-up boards. His eyes searched the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. He knew they couldn't stay here for long, but it was the only place they had for now, and they needed to rest. "We'll leave at first light," he said softly, turning back to her. "Get some rest. You need it." The girl nodded again, trying to find comfort in his words. She leaned back against the wall, trying to make herself as comfortable as possible. She didn't sleep immediately, but eventually, her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. The biker, however, remained awake, his eyes scanning the area, never allowing himself to relax. He couldn't, not until he was sure they were safe. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded-up window, casting long shadows across the room. The girl stirred, slowly waking up to the unfamiliar, musty scent of the abandoned building. Her body ached from the rough sleep on the floor, but the exhaustion that had weighed on her for days had finally lifted just enough for her to rest. She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then, the memories rushed back, everything she had been through, everything that had led her to this place. The biker had kept his promise, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest that the danger was far from over. She glanced across the room, where the biker was standing by the window, looking out at the still, silent desert. His face was hard, his expression unreadable as he scanned the horizon. She could tell he hadn't slept much, if at all. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. She didn't know how long they would be able to stay hidden in this rundown place. They needed a plan, something more than just running. She couldn't keep doing this. The girl sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, still groggy but determined. She had to know what their next move was. She stood up and walked over to the biker, her footsteps light and hesitant. "What now?" she asked quietly. He turned to face her, his eyes weary but focused. "We can't stay here long," he said. "We'll head out again once the sun's up. I've got to figure out where to go from here." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that told her how on edge he was. He was thinking, planning, always trying to stay 2 steps ahead of whatever threat was chasing them. The girl nodded, trying to hide the fear in her own eyes. She wanted to believe that they could make it out of this. She wanted to believe that they could outrun the danger. But deep down, she knew the truth. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape it forever. She had seen what happened to people who ran from their past, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep going. But as she looked at the biker, standing there with his eyes scanning the horizon, she knew that he would never give up on her. He would fight for her, no matter what. She owed him that same determination. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that still gripped her heart. "Whatever you decide, I'll do it." The biker's gaze softened for a brief moment, and he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." He turned back to the window, looking out over the barren desert once more. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, but neither of them spoke. The world outside was quiet, too quiet. The air hung still in the heat of the morning, as if waiting for something to break the tension. Then, out of the corner of his eye, the biker saw something move in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes in the distance, but they were too far away to see clearly. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get down," he whispered urgently. The girl froze. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His instincts were on high alert. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the same feeling he had gotten when the men had first started chasing them. They weren't alone anymore. He motioned for the girl to stay low as he moved to the door, carefully peering outside. The air was thick with dust, and the wind howled softly, carrying the scent of sand and heat. The desert was endless, but the figures in the distance were unmistakable. They were riding motorcycles. The biker's heart sank. He had hoped they would have more time before the danger found them again. But now it was clear, the men were back. He didn't know how they had found them, but they had, and they were closing in fast. The girl was standing beside him now, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. He was already calculating their options. The truck was still parked outside, but it wouldn't outrun the motorcycles. The only chance they had was to move quickly and stay ahead of them. He turned to her, his voice low but firm. "We're leaving. Now, get your things." She didn't hesitate, rushing to gather the few belongings she had left. The biker stepped outside, his eyes scanning the desert. The motorcycles were getting closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. He motioned for the girl to hurry. "Stay close," he said, his voice tight with urgency. The girl nodded, her face pale, but she didn't ask any more questions. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. The two of them quickly moved toward the truck, their footsteps quick and silent as they made their way to the vehicle. The biker kept his eyes on the horizon, watching the motorcycles as they got closer. The girl climbed into the truck, and the biker started the engine. He didn't waste time. He slammed the truck into gear and sped off, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as they raced down the road. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them catch her. Not now. Not ever. The truck barreled down the dusty road, the engine roaring as the biker kept his foot pressed hard on the accelerator. Behind them, the distant sound of motorcycles grew louder, closing in faster than he had anticipated. The girl sat in the passenger seat, her heart pounding in her chest as she gripped the seat tightly. She looked out the rearview mirror, her breath catching in her throat as the figures on the motorcycles became clearer. They were still far enough behind to give them a small head start, but not by much. The biker's mind raced as he thought of their options. There was no chance they could outrun the motorcycles on this road, not with the rough terrain ahead. They needed to find somewhere to hide, and fast. The girl's voice broke through the roar of the engine, her voice shaky. Are they still following us? He didn't have to look at her to know she was terrified. He could feel her fear, the tension in the air like a storm ready to break. Yeah, they're still on us, he said, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. But we're not stopping. We'll lose them. He swerved the truck around a bend, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as they careened down the narrow, winding path. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, the sound almost deafening. The girl looked over at him, her eyes wide with worry. Where are we going? She asked. I don't know, he replied, his jaw tight. We just need to keep moving. Don't look back. Just keep your eyes on the road ahead. The words came out almost mechanically, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to reassure her. He didn't know where they were going, but he couldn't afford to slow down. He couldn't afford to let the men catch them. Not now. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, a never-ending blur of sand and rocks. The truck jolted and bounced as they sped over the rough terrain, but the biker kept his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze focused on the horizon. He had been in worse situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping a promise. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. And right now, that meant getting them as far away from the danger as possible. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, and the biker could feel the pressure building in his chest. He needed a plan, something to throw them off track. As he scanned the road ahead, his eyes landed on a small cluster of trees up ahead, just off the road. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hide them for a moment. It was their best shot. Hold on, he said, his voice sharp. He slammed the truck into a sharp turn, sending it off the road and onto a narrow dirt path that led into the trees. The truck lurched and bounced as it hit the rough terrain, but the biker kept his focus, driving with precision. The girl's hand shot out to the dashboard, her body pressed back into the seat as the truck lurched sideways. What are you doing? She asked, panic rising in her voice. Just hang on, he said. We're losing them. The truck bounced through the trees, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle as they navigated the tight, twisting path. The sounds of the motorcycles were muffled now, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The biker pushed the truck harder, keeping the throttle open as they raced deeper into the trees. They couldn't stop here, not yet. He had to get them farther away before they made a move. The truck finally slowed as they reached a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees and brush. The biker slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a halt. For a moment, there was only silence. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, and the air was thick with tension. The girl looked at him, her face pale, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. They had made it. For now, the biker stayed in the truck, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He wasn't sure if they were safe yet, but he couldn't let his guard down. He had to be sure. He turned to the girl, his face hard. Stay here, he ordered. She nodded without a word, her gaze never leaving him. He climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the ground as he stepped into the clearing. The sound of the motorcycles had faded, but the danger was still very real. He couldn't take any chances. He moved carefully, crouching low as he scanned the area. He could feel his heart racing, his mind working overtime to calculate their next move. He didn't have a lot of options. He needed to know if the men were still out there, waiting for them to make a mistake. He moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. Nothing. The area was quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He stayed low, his breath steady as he waited. After a few long minutes, he turned back to the truck. The girl was still inside, her eyes wide with fear. He nodded at her, signaling that it was safe. For now, he climbed back into the driver's seat and started the truck, the engine rumbling to life. He turned to the girl, his voice steady. We're not safe here. We've got to keep moving. She nodded silently, her expression resigned. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. She trusted him, and that was enough. The truck pulled away from the clearing, the tires crunching on the dirt path. The biker kept his eyes on the road, his mind already working on their next move. The fight wasn't over yet, but as long as they kept moving, they had a chance. And he would make sure they didn't stop until they were free. The truck rumbled down the narrow dirt road, kicking up dust as the biker focused on the path ahead. The landscape was vast and empty, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The girl sat beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Despite everything that had happened, despite the constant danger they had been running from, she had managed to hold it together. The biker could see it in her, the way she had stopped questioning everything and started accepting that survival came with sacrifice, and that she could no longer wait for someone else to save her. They had spent hours on the road, the sun beating down on them, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The weight of their situation hung heavy in the air, but for the first time in a long while, the biker felt like they might actually make it out of this mess. They weren't out of danger, but they had managed to shake off the men who had been chasing them. For now, that had to be enough. As the truck moved steadily through the desert, the biker stole a glance at the girl. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but her expression was far from calm. She was still scared. She had every right to be, but there was something else there now. Something that hadn't been there before. A quiet resolve. "How are you holding up?" the biker asked, his voice soft but steady. The girl turned her head to look at him, her lips pulling into a faint, weary smile. "I'm okay," she said, though the fatigue in her voice betrayed her words. "You're right," she added after a pause. "We can't stop. Not yet." The biker nodded, understanding more than she realized. They had to keep moving. They couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. "We'll figure out where to go next when we're safe," he said, his voice resolute. "But for now, we just keep going." She nodded again, this time more firmly. He could see it. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She had become someone who understood what it took to survive, someone who had learned that sometimes the only choice you had was to keep moving forward. A few miles down the road, they came to a small, dilapidated gas station. The faded sign creaked in the wind, and the place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The biker slowed the truck as they approached, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. He wasn't taking any chances. The gas station was isolated, surrounded by the same vast desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. They didn't need to stop, but the biker knew they had to refuel. They needed more than just gas. They needed to keep a low profile, stay off the main roads, and figure out their next move. He pulled the truck up to one of the pumps and turned off the engine. For a moment, there was silence, the only sound the wind whispering through the cracks in the station's walls. The girl's eyes flicked nervously around, her hand resting on the door handle as if ready to jump out at a moment's notice. "I'll keep an eye out," the biker said, sensing her unease. "You stay here." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "I'll be fine," she whispered. He could see her trying to hold it together, trying to stay strong, and for that, he felt a surge of pride for her. He stepped out of the truck and walked over to the pump. As he started filling the tank, he kept his gaze trained on the horizon, his ears straining for any sound that might signal trouble. The wind picked up, swirling dust and debris through the air, but there was no sign of movement. He filled the tank as quickly as he could, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't afford to linger here too long, not with the danger still out there. The biker finished filling the tank and closed the gas cap, his hand lingering on the metal for a moment longer than necessary. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. The problem was, he didn't know what that plan was. He couldn't think that far ahead. All he could do was focus on getting them to safety one step at a time. He turned back to the truck, where the girl was waiting, her eyes watching him with quiet trust. "Let's go," he said. She didn't argue, didn't ask questions. She just climbed into the truck, and they continued on their way. The world outside was still vast and unforgiving, but for the first time in a long time, the biker felt a sense of hope rising within him. They had survived this far. They could survive more. As they drove on through the desert, the sun setting behind them, the girl looked out the window, her thoughts lost in the endless horizon. There were no easy answers, no guarantees that everything would be okay. But she was no longer the terrified child who had run from the shadows. She was stronger now, and that made all the difference. Together, they would face whatever came next. And that was enough. Explore the intense world of Hell Angels stories with a gripping narrative of survival, loyalty, and danger. This story follows a young girl on the run from mysterious pursuers, and her unlikely protector, a seasoned biker who promises to keep her safe. As the two race through the unforgiving desert, facing peril at every turn, they form a bond that reflects the core of Hell Angels stories: bravery, defiance, and the unbreakable will to survive. With danger closing in, the biker's past and his promise to her father come into play, pushing them both to their limits. Each twist and turn brings them closer to the dark forces pursuing them, but their only option is to keep moving. In true Hell Angels stories fashion, they find themselves in the fight of their lives, navigating treacherous terrain, uncertain allies, and a relentless pursuit. The narrative unfolds with suspense and action, capturing the essence of what it means to stand tall in the face of adversity. The story weaves through moments of vulnerability and courage, keeping you hooked until the final, heart-pounding moments. Hell Angels stories aren't just about the ride. They're about the sacrifices made, the decisions taken in the heat of the moment, and the unspoken understanding between two souls fighting for their survival. As the tale reaches its conclusion, the biker's vow to protect the girl remains unbroken, ensuring that Hell Angels stories live on in the form of their struggle and determination. This thrilling chapter brings you closer to the raw emotion and gritty realism of life on the edge, where survival is the ultimate prize. Immerse yourself in the world of Hell Angels stories, where every moment counts, and the fight for freedom never ends.